Just a couple more. I'd like to follow up. Ms. Henley, you were asked, I don't know, maybe it was Senator Cortez Masto on the issue of just privacy from a broader perspective, and recognizing that if we're using blockchain for energy transactions, you might not, perhaps you don't need the same level of anonymity, I guess. But a question would be how do you ensure then, if you have this anonymity that is we're saying, okay, this identification is not required, how do you ensure that you're not selling a product that might be subject to sanction?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think that this is an area which deserves a lot of attention and interest and actually engagement from regulators, because I think Dr. Narayanan stated it very well, that privacy functionality is being developed by the industry, but it is not robust enough at this stage, and is still in an early phase of development, and needs to be developed in particular with specific use cases in mind. What is it that regulators care about in terms of privacy? What is necessary to require? There is a productive collaboration there between technologists in continuing to work on the technology and regulators in setting specifications and requirements for the direction the technology and privacy in particular moves in.
So let me ask about the issue of regulation, because that's what we do up here as we advance legislation. Is it too early for us to be discussing the potential for legislation in this space? Mr. Golden, you mentioned in your testimony that regulatory barriers exist that restrict the transactions between the customer and the local utility. Should we expect some kind of a request to adopt federal regulations? You've got some interstate issues connected to these transactions. Speak a little bit about your perspective on the need for regulation at this point.
Yeah, EBRI doesn't generally sort of jump into the regulatory sort of realm, but really it's about looking at the technology itself and whether or not the technology is ready. And I think there's a lot more work that has to be done as far as whether or not this technology is ready to sort of participate in a transactive energy way. I think one area that maybe is also important for this transactive energy is the use of smart contracts. When we think about peers on a network selling electricity back and forth to one another, there needs to be some sort of contract in place. And I don't know that there's any sort of recognition from a legal framework of whether or not those smart contracts are actually enforceable. So that's one thing. And I think one of the senators mentioned that that in Ohio they had looked at sort of allowing for that contract to be something that is true and real and is recognized by the legal system. So I think those areas are areas for you to look at, and then also just keep an eye on the technology as it develops, like we will plan to research and develop.
Mr. Scarry?
I'd like to just add a little bit to that, in that I think an area of concern, besides personally identifiable information being made part of an immutable record, that you also have to look at anything else that the transaction parties might be placing within that block. So that you can put in illegal data into these blocks, and then they stay there. So that's another area of concern that should be reviewed as part of that process.
Well, then that takes me back to an issue that I raised with you, Dr. Khan, after your testimony, and that was the issue of trust. You explained that the focus of blockchain isn't creating blocks of data, but in creating data that can be trusted. And trust is one of those words that we don't often hear when we're talking about cybersecurity. And I guess I would ask you to just speak a little bit further about what more can be done to ensure that we are actually achieving this trust, how how does, you've mentioned that blockchain is just one option out there, but how does the trust that's created by this blockchain technology compare with other techniques that might be used in gaining that trust for the digital objects?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. And it's not going to be very easy to answer it directly because you have to get into all the ins and outs of how you trust blockchain and how it works and the like. And I don't think we really have time for that right here, and probably other people could address that equally well. But let me just say that in developing trust in any informational system, I might point out that things are not new, as in the Internet of Things, because when we did the original work on computer networking, the things we connected were big computers. So we're really still in the business of connecting things, big informational systems, little ones, whatever. You need to know what information you want. That means you've got to have a way of describing it, and it can't be semantics. It'll be different in different languages. That's why the importance of unique identifiers associated with digital objects. You can say, is the information I want is in the object who has this identifier, wherever it is in the information universe. And then you need to have some way of going from that identifier to actually accessing that information. Now, maybe you can't manifest it because it's all encrypted, but you've got to be able to get to it. So let me assume that you can interpret it when it shows up. Next thing you want to know is, can I trust that this information has not been tampered with? And that's a kind of an interesting question that deals in authentication technologies of one sort or another. Now, oftentimes you think you need some other set of records to know whether it's accurate, but in many cases you're dealing with information that is immutable, that is, it never changes. And if the information never changes, then you can actually create an identifier for that information cryptographically based on the content of the information, so that from the identifier you can get the information, and from the identifier you can validate whether that information was accurate or not. Doesn't require anything else. It's self-built in to the way that kind of system would operate. Now, if the information is changeable, you probably need to depend on another system. It could be a blockchain system. It could be many other kinds of systems. Well, there is one that's widely used throughout the world in the publication industry, in options trading, in managing building activities. It's called the handle system. Well, that's the trademark for it. But it's an identifier resolution system that's very powerful and has been on the internet for almost 30 years, actually 25, 27 years now. Widespread in the publications industry. It's hard to find any scientific journal that doesn't rely on this to identify references in those journals. So that's an important aspect of how you develop trust. You might develop it because the system itself is intrinsically trustable, doesn't depend on anything else, anywhere else. Doesn't depend on other service systems or whatever. The question is, can you get the information? This issue also has shown up in other areas where you have to learn to trust the cryptography. Like, if you could actually send information over another nation's satellite system, would you trust the information you got? Well, if you could get the bits and you believe in the strength of the cryptography, maybe the answer should be yes, or certainly yes in times of dire need. There's also the question of how you can trust in a particular object that has value when it's the bit stream itself that purports to have value, as in cryptocurrency, when you can actually transfer that, perhaps even anonymously, from one party to another. So if I transfer a bit stream that's got $100 of value to another party, who's got the $100 of value if I kept a copy of that same bit stream? So you have to have a way of understanding which is the real bit stream, even though they're both identical. And that can be done in a variety of ways, including through, if you read that paper I wrote on representing value with Patrice Lyons, that you will see that we actually go through that in detail. And it's not a blockchain solution, but it is one that's another alternative. And then finally, you need to know that the communication world that you're dealing with can actually get information through reliably. Because if you can't get the information, then all of the trust that you might have in it will never really materialize. So cybersecurity is important in terms of maintaining the flows, but also making sure that things can't be changed within the system. If I pull down an object which is, let's say, a piece of legislation, I'd like to know, is this the real piece of legislation? Well, you can't tell that necessarily from something else. You might have to look at the object itself to tell. You might want to know, is this the latest version? Has it been amended? You may want to get the prior version. And so all of those things go into building trust. And that's one of the things that we've thought through very seriously in the digital object architecture, but it's like a set of building blocks. It's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all. And every example that we have been involved in, we built probably dozens of systems of various kinds, including some for managing options trading around the globe, managing the construction of buildings and smart cities and things like that. Everyone is different. And there is no single solution that universally applies to everything. And you have to look at the issue of trust in managing the information and protecting it and securing it individually in every case. There is no universal solution that's going to work for everything now and in the future.
Well, I thank you for that. You're right. It's not something that you can respond to in a couple-minute blurb or this is a much broader and exceptionally important and very, very timely. Not a lot of trust that you have around the halls of Congress right now. Quite honestly, there's not a lot of trust that the American public has. You just think about what people get on their news. They're all wondering, is this real? We're not trusting much of anything nowadays. So making sure that we have architecture that can be trusted, I think will be exceptionally important moving forward. So I appreciate you outlining that. Senator King, any final words? I appreciate what you have provided the committee this morning. It has been very interesting, very enlightening. I think we've all learned a lot. This has been good to fill our heads with as we move forward. And I thank you for what you've contributed. With that, the committee stands adjourned.